All right. Welcome to another episode of the Aetherica Podcast. Uh, we're joined today with a very special guest. He is one of my personal favorite human beings to interact with. Ike and myself have both interviewed him individually on our own podcasts. I'd recommend everybody go and check those out. His studies span multiple systems of holistic healthcare, such as Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, Western herbal medicine, and Spagyric. He's got a clinical practice where he combines modern and traditional systems of natural medicine within an alchemical architecture. He's on the board of directors and is a professional member of the Herbalist Association of Nova Scotia and the board of directors of the Canadian Council of Herbalist Associations, and is a member of the International Alchemy Guild, a faculty member of the Spagyric School of Alchemy. He's an operative laboratory alchemist, and he is the founder of Secret Fire Apothecary. He is Daniel Wiseman. So, Daniel, so glad to have you, man. Is there anything else you want to throw out there and add about yourself before we get going?
No, I think you got the important details. Thanks for having me on. I love chatting with you both. So this should be fun. All three of us in one virtual room.
Yes. I got a herbalism question for you off the bat, kind of a random one, but so Meg and I we were going down this like rabbit hole on Kratom, because there's like Thai strains, there's Bali, Meng Da, uh, and
Are
then
you?
there's
You're not taking that stuff, are you?
I have kind of a Kratom problem.
Oh, for fuck's sake!
So there's like then there's like white, and then there's green, and then there's red. And then so she was explaining to me how it's like based on these different harvest times. And I guess that, depending on the stage and the cycle, they produce different compounds that lend to different effects or whatever. So I was curious, say something like metals in the earth, like the earlier ore, say if like it's mined at an earlier time and utilized within some process, does it contain particular energetic qualities versus if it was, you know, uh, out of the ground and sitting around for a while? Does it lose some sort of potency in terms of energetic or compounds, or is there any differences alchemically in that
With the
regard?
metals,
Yeah,
like
with
kind of just
metallics,
like
like if you got like an
yeah.
ore.
Well, yeah, there's the thought that if a metal has been refined, uh, that it dies, essentially. There's different thoughts on this, and I think some of them are interesting to explore and some of them don't really pan out. But the idea is that one of the ideas is that fire at some temperature will kill the spirit of a metal. Um, I'm not entirely convinced of that because I've processed metals with and without fire and still am able to bring things to success. Um, So it depends. Harvest time is an interesting question with this, right? Because we're talking about millions of years, right? This stuff is there, like a fresh harvest would be, you'd have to capture something from like a meteorite or something like that. And then the question is, well, how long has it been that metal or mineral before it even came to Earth? And it's difficult to compare to herbs in that sense, but I think that overall the processing of metals is or minerals too is important to consider. Um, Personally, I like to work from ores as much as possible because an ore is, it's the untreated natural form, so I get to control what is done or not done to that metal. Um, I have noticed differences in certain things. You could have like commercially prepared, let's say oxides or acetates and different forms of metals and minerals, and then you could, contrast to working with natural ores and see. what comes out of it, and I've had mixed results. Sometimes I get, I've never had I've never had a natural ore let me down. Sometimes commercial sources of metals and minerals, I've had lackluster results, but it's mixed. So it's hard for me to really take a side in this. It's I think it's an interesting question to ponder, and also too, we never know exactly what the context or intention of someone's words is when they say, "Oh, this kills a metal," or this source is dead and this source is alive. It's very subjective. We don't have like a working standard to go by. In the history of alchemy, you have constant arguments more than you have agreements. And translation is another thing, of course. Authorship is often in question. It could be 10 people, it could be one person. There's so many things to consider when looking at these statements made. But I think the most important thing is to do the work, see if it works or see if it doesn't work. Put it to the test, rather than just getting too heady about it. So mixed results. But overall, I prefer to use natural ores, go straight to the source and work from that. There's always, even the idea of just like with farming, like the place something comes from, makes a difference, and I think it's a little bit more difficult to make a strong chemical argument with the metals. Like with plants, we could say, oh, these plants growing over here, oh, the soil is acidic and rich in this mineral or that mineral. When we talk about metals, I mean, gold is gold is gold. It's all the same thing, or another metal. It's all the same thing. But the idea that there's different energetics to a space, a place, I think that holds some weight. So I consider that too, and that's another reason why I like to harvest my own stuff when I can. Because I know the areas, and I can go to a place where I can harvest without over harvesting. Minerals, it's kind of hard to overdo on a personal scale, but yeah, it's a good question, and it's something I've thought a lot about. I've spent a lot of time cross comparing things to see what actually holds up. That's one of my favorite things to do with these so-called like truths, is to tease them out, see what works, what doesn't work, and in the end, find your own way to determine whether something's valid or not.
Yeah. And so, like, kind of speaking to the place and say geologically and geographically, I don't know if you have a theory on this, or if there's some sort of understanding or consensus about this, but with ores and the rate at which they grow or the places in which they grow, I would assume that it probably has a lot to do with the materials that are native in the soil that they're growing in. But then I also wonder, because we do know that there's electromagnetic like currents, there's telluric currents in the earth, and there's certain energetic qualities to those things. And I don't know if you've ever come across or have heard any theories about the potentials of whether an ore of a metallic can, if this sort of energetic quality would lend to its growth or anything along these lines, or are there any patterns that have to do with things that people have detected and noticed or measured as far as like electromagnetism and the earth and how that affects ore growth or anything like that?
Perhaps. I think some things like electromagnetism might be a little more difficult to kind of get a sense of whether it's having an effect on the growth of something. Because I think largely when we look at the mineral kingdom, like these things are being born in the most extreme situations, right? Which is also why I question the idea that fire kills an ore, or like a strong acid. That's another idea. People say, oh, if you use strong acids like aqua regia or nitric acid, aquafortis, all these things that these strong acids or fire will kill the metal, and it's like that's like saying your mother will kill you. You know what I mean? These things are born in extreme environments. They're born in volcanoes and inside the earth, or they're brought here. That's the other thing is there's a lot of mystery to where everything comes from. I think largely we can see that we've been kind of seeded. We're bombarded with comets and things like that that um bring these metals to Earth. Like the gold, for example, they say comes from stars or platinum, essentially coming from supernovas. So if something can survive a supernova or is born of a supernova, um, I don't think my, acids or my little forge of, 1,000 or maybe 1,500 degrees at very, very most, is going to do any harm. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's interesting to see how things occur, though. Maybe this speaks to your question, like, you get abundance of certain things in certain places, and then those places also have certain, just like, people in different places have different cultures and languages and things like that. There's something about, unique to environments, right? And those environments are made up of not just organic, but inorganic materials. And to rule out that those inorganic materials have an effect or are affected by an area, I think would be, um, you know, uh, an overreach. It's something to consider, but it's hard. I think these are things that are difficult to really prove out. But it's clear that different areas produce different stuff in varying amounts. And then the environments, if we could think of these inorganics as building blocks, a lot of the time, the organic life that builds upon the inorganic life is largely affected by this inorganic substrate that the organic stuff grows from. Different plants like different pH or minerals and things like that, and then you get different insects, and it just goes right up through the chain of life, right? So there's something to it, but it's hard to say exactly. And I think that there's definitely a strong idea that metals or minerals and crystals store information, particularly crystals. That's something that a lot of people speak on, is the idea that crystals can hold memory, and even metals can form in crystals. So, perhaps metals, minerals, gemstones have a unique energy based on the environment that they're in. And I imagine that if that's true, then their pockets are quite deep because they've been there for probably millions or billions of years, right? So they have quite um, a stock of information in them if this theory is true, right? And this is something that it is talked about, and I think it's one of the reasons why the metallic kingdom is considered to be the most potent of all the kingdoms, because it's so old and contains so much information of all of this time that it's passed through. And often they're quite pure. When we're working with metals or minerals and we can isolate them, we're working with just one thing. And there's something to be said about that. It's less mixed in nature compared to like a plant or an animal is so much more complex in chemistry, right? Like if we're working with gold, it's gold. Once it's purified, like there's nothing else. It's gold, right? Compared to a plant with hundreds or thousands of different compounds that make them up.
Yeah. This is kind of related, I guess. So there's a post that you posted, and it was labeled "The Seeds of Venus." It's like copper acetate crystallizing or something like this. And then so I was wondering, so is the crystallization of a metallic acetate considered a seed of that metal in some sense? And is it different than the spirit of the salt of a metal or similar, or what's up with that?
Um, I can't remember the exact post, but I would imagine that what I was speaking about might have been actually about crystallization specifically, and not the metal. Let's
Mm.
say if we're talking about Venus, we're speaking about copper. Um, I may have been speaking about seeding crystals. So, if you have a supersaturated solution of a soluble metal, let's say copper, because you're talking about Venus here. So if we've got copper as an acetate, so let's say we've got copper in vinegar, and that solution is really saturated. If we have like another small piece of a copper acetate crystal, you can introduce that to the liquid and it'll act as like a nucleation point where crystals will grow off of that seed. So that it's a seed because it starts the process just like a seed starts a plant. You put this seed into this supersaturated liquid, then you'll get this complex crystal form that will grow off of this seed, grow out of it, almost looking like, like a plant emerges out of a seed, but with a metal. So that's probably what I was speaking to. Sometimes the idea of seeding something, that terminology is used um, sometimes when we're bringing like the universal spark of life into a work, when we're bringing Mercury, this universal animating principle. You can seed life into something. You can bring this like some sort of chemical carrier of this spark of life, and reintroduce it into dead things. Like this is common. We were just speaking about the idea that maybe fires or acids can kill metals, and people who follow that path, um, if they do use the fire or acid, they may later on in the process try to bring that spark of life, which they believe they've lost, back into the work using some source of this universal spark of life, which we call Mercury. So that's another example of when we might use that term. But I think that it was the latter, with a super saturated solution and causing crystallization by introducing a crystal to that solution.
Yeah. And then so in order to purify a metal, I think it's my understanding that you first have to open it, right? Is that correct? Like you have to open up the metal, and then I'm wondering like what could you describe what's happening when you're opening a metal to allow for that purification to begin?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's kind of two different things really here. So opening really isn't purification. Opening is kind of something that happens, although you can maybe argue that part of the opening is the purification process. So purifying would be to like separate a pure mineral, metal, gemstone from an ore. Like if I've got this big quartz crystal growing out of this other, a rock essentially, and we want to separate that out to just work with the quartz. There's various methods that you can use, right? You can use just manual manipulation of it. Like if you can just crack off that quartz crystal, break it off with a chisel and hammer or something. That's a simple way of it. But also too, with purification, you can use different methods like smelting, like melting things down, or using different um, acids and bases and solvents in general to kind of separate one thing from another. And this is the purification process, but the opening is is a different process, and in my understanding, opening really has a lot to do with bringing a non-soluble metal or mineral or gemstone into a soluble form. Most often, what we see being created are salts, water-soluble salts, and so this is kind of a first step in what I call like turning a metal inside out. Like the idea that is that there's this soul inside of a metal that we're looking to tease out, soul or spirit, both really, and we're looking to tease these out to use them in our work, or use them as medicines for ourselves, or use them as medicines for other metals and things. Um, and this step really seems to be, again, about turning this non-soluble form, this very like impenetrable metal, the metal's gates are entirely closed at this stage, like let's say gold in metallic form, and then we're reducing it to or converting it to a water soluble salt. And in that state is when it is susceptible to basically catalyzing an oil. Like when we bring in unique menstruums that are prepared, they will react with this open metal. That's the thing with metals, minerals, and gems. A lot of them are very kind of inert, right? They don't really react. When we use our basic solvents that we may use with the plant kingdom, let's say just alcohol, you throw alcohol, some gold and some alcohol in, nothing happens. You could throw gold in the ocean for a million years and come back and it's basically just the same as it was when you first put it in there, because that's one of the big things about gold is that it's so indestructible. So the opening really is about kind of getting past these really tightly closed gates of the metal in order to be able to tease out the soul or spirit of a metal or mineral or gem.
And so is it what's considered an alkahest? Is that what is allowing you to open it?
Generally not. That's like the
No.
next step, really.
Okay.
So like an Alkahest or philosophical Mercury. Sometimes these terms are used synonymously. Some people believe that they're a couple different things, but regardless of that, that's really the last step where it's like we've opened the metal. So now we have, let's say, a salt form. We'll just use gold as an example. So you've started with metallic gold and you've reduced this gold to a chloride salt of the gold. Now it's water soluble. And now you introduce your alkahest or your philosophical mercury. And this is where the oil is catalyzed from this process. It's like these opened metals or minerals, they're more reactive. They're able to react with these specialized menstruums that we create. And that's what gives birth to these oils. Because of course there's no oil actually in any of these inorganic materials, but they can create oils. So it's a catalyzing of an oil, and that is largely dependent upon the metal or mineral being opened in the first place. So opening often is done with acids and alkalis, essentially, either one end of the spectrum or the other. So let's say with dry path alchemy, we'll use gemstones as an example. Gemstones can be calcined and crushed up, mixed with a strong alkali like potassium that you can get from wood ashes, essentially. And then you melt them together, you fuse them together. So this is like a dry menstruum. The potassium, the salts from the wood ashes will melt with the metal or gemstone and melt into a homogeneous glass, which is water soluble. So now it's opened and it will react readily with these specialized solvents. Or with the wet path, often you're using things like acids. Aqua regia is one of the most famous ones, or aqua fortis, which is nitric acid, whereas aqua regia is hydrochloric acid and nitric acid combined. So often these are acids, or even simple vinegar, right? Acetates are born of vinegar. So that's a more mild acid that you can derive from the plant kingdom to open different metals and minerals and even gemstones sometimes. So yeah, you're using two different unique sets of menstruums essentially in this process, where one is to open and the other is to actually catalyze an oil and spirit from these inorganic substances.
Okay. So you open it up with a particular menstruum and then you react it or catalyze it with an alkahest, and then at some point you purge the alkahest like through a coagulation. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is an important part, and I think it's something that speaks to, well, I think the entire philosophy of alchemy actually. So, um, I'll back it up a little. I know you've asked me about this idea of being able to perpetually create an oil from one metal. Let's say you have 1 gram of gold. It's a very small amount, but if you work well and you understand the principles at play here, you could essentially forever make the oil of gold from that 1 gram of gold. It's not really depleted. You get the gold back, right, in the process. And what it speaks to is this simple principle that there's this universal spark of life that animates everything. We call it Mercury in alchemy. And when universal Mercury becomes embodied, like encased in a unique physical body, let's say this is the salt principle in alchemy, that merger of universal spirit and individual body, it creates a soul. That the soul, and sometimes people struggle with the concept of, okay, what's a spirit and what's a soul? What's the difference between these things? And in this particular understanding and context, spirit or Mercury is universal. It's in its pure state, it's undetermined by unique bodies, right? It's this shared universal spark of life that is in absolutely everything. But when it enters into a physical body, that unique encasement of that universal spark of life, it's able to express uniquely that universal principle, and that unique expression of that universal principle of life, Mercury, is the soul, the sulfur, and it's born of it. And this is played out very clearly with the metallic work, because you see it in front of your eyes. You've got something that has no oil in it, right? Like a metal or a mineral. There's no oil. And a spirit, this unique, let's say, Alkahest or philosophical Mercury. There's many names that these menstruums go by. But this menstruum that you're using, it is a carrier, a representative of this universal spark of life. When you bring them together, an opened metal or mineral and gem with this solvent, that's where these oils are produced. So this philosophy is confirmed, with this chemical reality. We've got this spiritual idea that a spirit in a body creates a soul, but we see it in the lab work when we do it. And I think that's really the sign of truth, right? When your philosophy and your laboratory practice are completely harmonious with one another. To me, that holism marks truth. And this is such a simple but also grand truth, right? This concept of a universal spirit in an individual body. It's happening, well, in all of life, right? It's not just the metals. Like, we can make that same example with plants. Plants draw up, metals and minerals, largely solubilized metals and minerals. There's bacteria and there's fungi and things like that in the soil, which will make available these metals and minerals to the plants. This unique relationship between the roots of the plant and bacteria and fungi. This relationship will help draw up and convert these metals and minerals into usable forms, just like we do with the metallic work. And then the plant draws it up into itself. And then the plant has these unique representatives of, let's say, spirit or Mercury. Like, plants have alcohols and they have acids, they have ketones, they have these things that we think of as solvents or spirits. And then when they mix with these metals and minerals that the plants are consuming, new compounds are formed of that. So like this is repeated all throughout life, where these universal spirits are carriers of the universal spirit combine with unique physical bodies, and of that, unique organic compounds are created, which are essentially chemical carriers of what we call the soul or the sulfur in alchemy. So it's very simple, but it's a grandiose truth, I think, in a lot of ways. It's like, which I think a lot of the best truths of alchemy really are quite simple. It's sometimes the first time you take a stab at something, you go the long way. You go the long and the hard way. You learn your lessons. You get to your final destination point. Then you can look back and see, oh, I should have gone this way instead of that way, and you get better and better and better at it. But once you arrive at, closer to the truth, it just keeps getting more and more simple, right? And this principle, I think, is so simple. Universal animating spark of life, when it's encapsulated in a unique body, it expresses that universal principle of life uniquely, and that's what we refer to as a soul. And with the metallic work, this is a key concept. I mean, and there are things that dip outside of this, these basic steps we talked about, like opening the metal or purifying it first and then opening it and then catalyzing an oil with these special solvents. Like there's of course many other paths that follow something similar or even go a completely different direction. But this is a major topic that you can find throughout, thousands of years of ideas in alchemy. It always shows its head, these wet and dry path ways of working with metals. And it makes sense of it, because again, you can't extract an oil from a metal, right? There is no oil to be extracted from it, but it can be born of it. And again, I think the truth speaks loudly because we see this all throughout life. Like I made the example with the plant pulling up these metals and minerals and creating these unique organic compounds, which are, imagine a plant's producing all these compounds which create the smells and tastes and effects that we know of as a plant. And we can think of those as like personality traits of these plants, right? And personality trait is, it's the soul of the plant. So this concept just works so easily throughout. So I know there's a bit of a digression from your question about purging the solvent, but I think it's an important kind of foundation to lay down to understand the purging of the solvent in the end too, because I think there's a very important and unique thing that happens at this stage. I think superficially, it's these solvents tend to not be safe for consumption. So on one hand, we want to remove these from the final product because they're not so safe. Like many of the spirits that we use in the metallic kingdom, let's say they're strongly acetone based, and although acetone is in our blood, we don't want to consume too much of it. It's very strong smelling and tasting, so you want to remove it. But there's something really special that happens in this process of removing it if you work in a certain way, which again speaks to this simple philosophy that alchemy outlines of, a spirit entering a body and a soul being born. So basically, we've got our open metal, we've got our Alkahest, let's say, or philosophical Mercury. They come together, they create an oil, and then you gently distill it off, to remove it. But by gently distilling it off, you take a little bit of the volatile soul, the volatile constituents of this oil that's being created. Some of it will distill over. So imagine this is like a philosophical death that's happening, right? We've created this oil in this open mineral, and then some of it's being removed. The soul and the spirit, the body is essentially dying in a way, and the soul and the spirit are passing over in this distillation, and then it can be returned to that same body. It speaks to the idea of reincarnation, and that our souls evolve with this process of dying and being reborn over and over again. And again, this is perfectly reflected in the physics or the chemistry of what happens in this process, because when we distill out the Alkahest or philosophical Mercury, and it carries with it these new volatile compounds, when we bring that back to the open salt and cohobate again, bring them back together again, these oils that are carried over, they start reacting with the salts as well. So basically what you get is more and more and more soul by repeating this simple process of separating the spirit and the soul from the body and putting it back into the body, repeating over and over again, like this idea of reincarnation, the soul or the oil in this case becomes more rich, it becomes more abundant, it becomes more aromatic, becomes more complex. So I think it again speaks to this very physical confirmation of this concept of life and death and repeating that cycle, like the soul's evolution through its death and rebirth in a body.
This is so interesting, because there was something that you had written, I think you say written, that you had, I don't know, whatever. You said, after you purge it of its alkahest, you then it's ready for its fresh clothes or something, like it's ready for its impregnation or something along those lines. And and it reminded me of, like, when you said it's ready for its fresh clothes, this idea of that Ike has spoken to me about like the astral garments as the soul is being incarnate, and it's kind of collecting its astral garments as it's coming down. And I don't know, I just thought that was interesting. Do you know what I'm talking about, Ike?
Well, there's a lot of stuff actually that Dan's talking about that is really Platonic. I think that we made a little bit of a digression there, but it's important because not I don't think all the listeners are going to necessarily be on the same level that we kind of are out of the gate here. So I think it was good we defined certain ideas and terms. And one of the things that Dan said about particularly the soul, right? We understand the soul being the sulfur and these kind of uh, if we want to look at them as the qualities of selfhood and things like that, it corresponds directly in Platonic philosophy and Platonic metaphysics with the idea that the soul is this internal process of selfhood, but also, as Dan said, it is the animating spark. It's very, very important because a lot of people will mix that up. They'll start talking, they don't know the difference. Like, to Dan's point earlier, people don't understand what's the difference between soul, what's the difference between spirit. And I think it's really important to emphasize that. I mean, this is consistent with 2,500 years worth of cosmology, metaphysics, and philosophy, is that the soul is what animates things. That spark of life that enters into something, that when you look at me and you can see the life behind my eyes, that's my soul. And so there's a lot of Platonic crossover here that every time I go through it, because I don't speak as much, obviously I have, I've have a lot of experience in biochem, but I don't speak at the same, or I don't look at alchemy. My mind isn't habituated with in terms of scientific vernacular. I just don't prefer it. I can hang with it, but I don't like it. So what I'm listening to and hearing really is, despite all this, there's this tremendous Platonic thing that's coming through, and I can't remember if it was Dan or somebody else. Might have been somebody else told me that when I was looking for, I mean, Sky, it might have been you. When I was looking for early on in the Arcanum channel, when I was looking for references for alchemy to read resources, somebody told me that I had to read the Golden Chain of Homer. And when I picked up the actual copy in Latin, it's Platonis. It's the Golden Chain of Plato, which I found really, really interesting. So you start flipping through this thing, and it's really using. It's a specifically alchemical text, really. It's central to a lot of alchemists that I respect, a lot of their work and their philosophy and understanding, and it discusses through the Homeric works and Platonic philosophy the interconnectivity of everything in existence. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of interplay here. I think, Sky, what you were talking about is the astral garments of porphyry,
Hmm.
which essentially is when the soul incarnates, it kind of has this tabula rasa state, right? Because the symbolic narrative that we use to describe really the soul's death to that spiritual world. It has to, in order to incarnate, for that life spirit, that animating force to vivify things which are otherwise dead materially, it has to die to that material realm. And in a human being, in the Platonic sort of symbolic narrative, we say that the soul drinks from the river Lethe, which means that it takes a draft of that water before incarnating and forgets everything that happened beforehand. This is a symbolic, tabula rasa, but it's a symbolic narrative for that spiritual death that the soul must undergo. And then as it moves closer, as it becomes encosmic, meaning within the cosmos, it descends through the planetary spheres, and at each one receives, this is now specifically Porphyry, working within obviously the Platonic and late Platonic, Neoplatonic milieu. He's talking about how the blank soul sort of at each of the spheres takes on a vice and a virtue. And these are the astral garments, the accretions that we put on. And again, poetically, symbolically, gradually weigh us down. And we succumb more and more to Earth's gravity. And the final product is really based on this experience of taking things on. Now, I don't know how much that correlates to Dan's understanding of alchemy. I would assume that there's something in there, but I think that's what you were referring to, right, Sky?
Totally.
Yeah.
Strong correlation. It's all the same stuff. We're just, saying it in different ways, and some of what you said there got me thinking, because in alchemy, we've got the fixed and the volatile soul, right? So the volatile soul or sulfur is considered the higher and indestructible soul. The idea is that, only that which is true can survive the fire, and when we, if we are to subject, let's say, an oil, let's say we've created from a metal to fire, only a portion of it will distill over without being adulterated. And it's a very, very small portion of it. It's like the idea that, maybe our souls evolve beyond a single life, but we leave behind a lot of what made up that soul in its past life, right? And we see that physically in alchemy, where most of the sulfur is not volatile. You could force it over at higher degrees of temperature, but it changes entirely. It becomes carcinogenic when it starts to burn. But there's this very, very volatile portion of that, which is it shares a boiling point with the spirit, or the chemical carrier of the spirit, and they travel over together, and they're almost inseparable. There's the idea that only God can make that perfect separation, because these things they stay together, and it's like, you get mostly spirit coming over, but then this tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of volatile sulfur, which you could say determines that little bit of universal spirit still to an individualized selfhood, like you said, that can be then returned in reincarnation to a body that physically is represented in this process that we're just describing, of like distilling off the Alkahest or Mercury and then returning it over and over and over again to the salts. And it's an interesting thing, and maybe there's a Platonic relationship here, I'm not sure, but the end goal here when you do this is, eventually this process stops creating more oil, and what you'll see and smell is these unique volatile compounds that distill over at first. Eventually they don't any longer. And what you get is, supposedly this perfect merging between, the totally non-physical and physical side of life. You've got this body and spirit, and you've now fixed the volatile, so to speak. This spirit, which is volatile, this spark of life, through this succession of living and dying and living and dying and living and dying, eventually reaches a state of balance, of equilibrium, where this thing is embodied, this universal spirit, and it becomes perfected. and supposedly immortal, or all these, grandiose claims that come with it. And I could
Well,
say,
yeah,
at least to a certain degree.
it's embodied. It's even like the Hermetic, or you could even look at it as having a correlation to Freemasonry with the square and the compasses. This idea of squaring the circle, that geometrically intractable problem, right? Where the square representing angularity is the physical matter, the material, the material realm itself, and then the circle having no angularity, no beginning, no point, no end, is a representative of eternity. And the merger of these two is the completion of the great work, really. And so you see, it's really interesting because all of the stuff we're talking about are spiritual analogs. They're material phenomenon that mirror an eternal process, but also a primordial process. Right. And so it's applicable to everything, particularly when you look at the works of Zosimus of Panopolis, the metallurgist, who his foundational text regarding alchemy. He talks about basically, look, we found this pattern in metals and we found it in plants. But as we continue to look, we realize it's everywhere. It applies to the soul. It applies to the spirit. It applies to the body.
Mhm.
So what you're talking about here is essentially is the goal of initiation. It's not even just alchemy. So this
Yeah,
it's really interesting to me. I'm very
be all end
gets me
all.
excited.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, and it's to what you said too about the chemistry. It's like, alchemy is what made me interested in chemistry, because I started to see, I had more of an academic interest in the esoteric and occult. I was interested because it just seemed like everybody important throughout history was interested in it, and so that drew me to it. But when I started practicing alchemy, I started seeing these philosophical or spiritual ideas physically manifesting in front of me, giving me these external examples to peer at and say, "Oh, wow, like this makes sense now." So for me, it became, well, very helpful to start understanding chemistry, because it helped me become a better alchemist, because we're dealing with these physical vehicles. And I think that's a really important point for people to understand, is that, sulfur is not the essential oil of a plant, and the spirit is not the alcohol from a plant. Like, those are examples of physical characteristics, or carriers of these philosophical principles. There are all these different ways which these non-physical things can manifest, and some of these vehicles, let's call them, are better than others. Like, they are more alike their philosophical principle than not. So they become better, and you see these things move around, and like move back and forth between different chemicals and things like that in the work. And it's really about understanding this correlation between physical and non-physical, and finding how they agree or disagree with one another. So chemistry has just become so much more interesting, because again, it's giving me these solid, like, bite and chew on examples
Yeah.
to prove out these philosophies or spiritual ideas. It's and then you realize, it's not just happening, of course, outside of you in this lab work, but it's of course happening inside you as well. And we could go on a huge tangent about that, about biological processes and how they, are doing all the same things that we're doing in the lab work externally, right?
Yeah. And when I was going to school, I went back to school when I joined the Golden Dawn and I began studying this stuff. I was going for, I went for body work and physical therapy. And so there's a tremendous amount of biochem and things like that in there. And then I eventually parlayed into Chinese medicine. So what I really got to see is that very interesting crossover. First, you look at things like on an atomic level, just the basic principles of how things are put together, positive, negative, and neutral. Right? This is tria prima.
Yeah. So
It's
so simple. Yeah.
and not only that, but when studying Kabbalah, it's the supernal triad. And then
Mhm.
as I get into Greek philosophy, it's the three hypostases. We're talking about a primordial, this one substance that behaved or underwent three phases.
Mhm.
And since that time, right, as Eliade would say, in illo tempore, since that time, everything that has ever come into existence has been some reflection of that threefold permutation. And not
Mhm.
only that, but then you see the binary, right, which is also a key factor in things like alchemy, celestial salt, celestial niter, and we have in Kabbalah we have the two pillars of mercy and severity, Yakim and Boaz, Hermes and Solomon. You've got this obviously, yeah. There's lots of gray area.
Of course.
But the binary is necessary to create the spectrum, and you see a lot of that in biochem with like you look at enzymes and things like that. A lock and key system, it's called. You know what I'm saying? So chemistry, biochem, chemistry of all sorts is it's the greatest affirmation that these wacky sages on a mountain somewhere, 2,000 years ago, were fucking right.
Yeah.
They figured it out without fucking microscopes. So it is very important. I tend to, it's I tend to I really enjoy it and I love it, but it's not something I feel like I'm an expert at. So I try not to speak about things I'm not an expert at. But I love listening to you guys go back and forth because you have much more of a handle on it in terms of how it applies alchemically. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, that's why I think this is a really unique and special kind of right. We're doing this interesting triad conversation tonight, where
Mhm.
there's this alchemical and scientific kind of uh, symposium going on, but then also we're tying it back to initiation, tying it back to philosophy, and to really show that alchemy is applicable to everything, and that's
Mhm.
what's so perplexing about it,
Yeah.
right? Because you could be when you talk about alchemy, you be talking about anything.
Where
you know?
everything goes, right? People always say, "Oh, sorry, maybe that was off topic," and it's like impossible. It would be so impressive if you could find something that was off topic when talking about alchemy, right? It's just, and again, back to the simplicity of it too. It's like really everything is only doing one thing. And as complex as that one thing is, everybody and everything is only doing one thing. And when you break it down to that polarity, like you said, it's just it's these two poles, and they've been separated and they appear to be opposite to one another, yet they're on this journey of finding how they can merge as one again. Everything is going through that process of finding this balance point. Um, and it's interesting because it's like that balance point is, universal in the sense that anything and everything is, either whole, it's that wholeness, like at the beginning of things, or these things are going back, these opposites are moving back towards that wholeness. So there's that one part which is very universal, and let's call it like fate. But then there's the individual side of it too, where the balance point for everything is not necessarily the same place. So you get this uniqueness too, where these polarities are playing out in almost infinite amount of ways, and balance points can be found, harmony can be found in many, many, many different ways. So you've got fate and free will kind of coexisting.
Yeah.
Everybody's doing the same thing, but we're doing it uniquely, which is, I mean, it makes for a great show, that's for sure. There's,
Yeah.
it's not boring life. That's,
There's a question that I had in mind in the beginning, but I wanted to kind of let you and Sky kind of go down the trajectory you were on because it was sort of unfolding in a really organic way. But it goes back to the idea of kratom. Um, the thing for me that I'm interested to know. So you and I have spoken, and you have a very strong hold on the vernacular of alchemy, but also on chemistry. But I've also found that you have a very strong hold on the symbolic vocabularies that we use. You and I were talking about astrology the last time we met, and biodynamic growing and things like that. So I'm wondering if right. somebody like me who has a history with addiction, with particularly noxious substances, like cocaine, things like that. Do you find that addictive, or not, maybe not even the compounds themselves, but the plants from which they are synthesized? Do they have these addictive plants? Do they have a particular signature? Is there a particular quality to them? What is the quality of their sulfur, maybe, that, or any part of their constituents, that you might have found? I mean, do you work with plants like that? Because I mean, even things like mahuang, right? I mean, the ephedrine plant, it's a very
Yes.
common plant.
We were just
It's
talking about that the other day, Daniel.
oh yeah, it's true. Yeah. Yeah, no, we were exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's I don't think that there's one particular signature, and I actually think, I'll slightly just go off a little bit topic here, but I think it speaks to what Gabor Mate speaks about as his idea of the root of addictions, right? I think it depends on what is the source of the pain that causes the addiction. So I think it could be anything, right? You could be addicted to almost anything. Sure, there are certain things that are more likely to cause addictions than others. But, when you really dive deep into it, you know, not everybody who tries cocaine gets addicted to it. Not everybody who tries heroin gets addicted to it. When you look at some of the most addictive substances derived essentially from plants originally, um, not everybody gravitates to the same thing, and then, we could talk about addictive behaviors and all these different things. And I think it really reflects, okay, you've got a source of pain, it's part of your journey, and addictions are a not so great way to medicate that pain. And pain is so subjective. So it could be any, planetary signature of an herb or a metal, or it could be anything. I think it's just reflection of pain and seeking to heal, despite how, bad an addiction can be for the body or for the spirit. Um, it is still an attempt in the end to heal, even if it's not a great one, or the best way to do it. So it's unique, so not
What
one
about
or
things
the
like
other.
coffee, do you think? Something that these simple addictions that we kind of take for granted, or tobacco,
Hmm. Those are Mars plants, right? And so
right?
that's it. You will see that correlation, right? So it's like, the big answer to the question is, yeah, it could be anything and everything. But then you've got the heavy hitters, right? Like Mars just has that crazy fire to it, right? So you get these strong substances. Actually, you get a lot of really alkaloid-rich plants that fall under the banner of Mars. Or let's say you get a lot of psychoactive plants or poisonous plants that fall under the banner of Saturn, so there's some, like, you know some spots in astrological rulerships where you can say, oh yeah, there's a lot more like addictive substances which fall under these certain classifications, compared to, say, you know Venus. Like the malefic planets often have a lot of these substances categorized underneath them, right? Like Saturn and Mars. So yeah, I mean, there's some patterns there for
Well,
sure.
yeah, and you're right, right? Because I mean, it's that typically that will be some kind of compensation. So it does, I think there's something to what you're saying. It's a very interesting point. What's going on inside the person that is drawing them to fire, or drawing them to, Saturn, which is more earthy, or um, sort of dark and distant. So yeah, I think that that's a very interesting and nuanced approach there.
Hmm. Hmm. And Saturn, I think one thing to think about with Saturn plants is, like, it's it's protection, right? Saturn is that leaden shell, right? So sometimes when, there's a pain and you want to protect yourself, you want to hide away, right? So Saturn plants come through there. I mean, there's a million things an infinite amount of things we could think of in kind of psychoanalyzing addictions and the rulerships of the substances that are that people are addicted to. But again, I think it all comes down to that root of the wound that we're trying to heal. Whether it's a great way to do it or not, that's a whole other topic. But that's what I'd say the root of all this is pain, is being separate, right? It's like you used to be this one thing and you've been ripped apart and have amnesia and at whatever level of consciousness you are of that you're trying to make your way home and feel whole again, right? Be healed.
So buy some Spagyrics at Secret Fire Apothecary and cure all of it.
Well, let me give you a plug real quick. I was sick as shit for like 2 weeks, and I think somehow Sky and Meg found out, so they sent me a bottle of Echinacea
Oh, yeah.
Spagyric. The fucking thing took care of it in like 2 days. It was
That
done.
shit's amazing.
Dead. It was, and
It's
you know what the thing
it's
is
good
too?
plan.
It had this. I didn't dilute it because it
Oh,
was
yeah.
so bad in my
Yeah.
throat.
I don't either. I want you feel it. You're like, oh yeah, that's doing something.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Oh my God. It was like I don't know, like little tiny worker gnomes started construction on my throat. It was like unbelievable. It was like unbelievable. It was you could really feel it and a little boost in energy, and I definitely I mean, this can be a little TMI, right? But that's what Aetherica Podcast is for, is to is
All
to just
good.
kind of just let the hair down. I had a really nice burst of energy and clarity of consciousness for about 20 minutes to a half hour after I took the echinacea tincture. It took care of everything that was going on in my throat. And to be honest, like I've taken a lot of I've taken a few other tinctures, and like all they did was give me really bad diarrhea. Now that might be that might be like,
Purgative.
yeah, something that's going on in me, but I had a very, very, very like, can I say clean? It was
Yeah.
just a very clean experience. So very
I,
bright.
well, I think, really that's what we're trying to do with alchemy, right? Is strip away the dross, like, right. We're going through these processes of figuring out what we're not in order to get closer to what we are. Or that's a personal journey, or we do the same thing with plants or metals, is like we're stripping away these leaden shells that are holding back the innate potential, the highest potential that everything's got built into itself, right? So when you start stripping away these layers, not just stripping away, but transforming or transmuting them, it's cleaner. Yeah, it's clearer. It's like the signature, the energy, the essence of that thing is it rings like a bell. It starts to get clearer and better, and then you have less of what you don't want and more of what you want from an effect. Of course, sometimes we need to clean and we need to purge. So sometimes that's what we're looking for. And certainly, if you want that experience, I could give you some plants that will do
No,
that. But
no, I'm
but
good.
yeah, the echinacea is special, and that's one that I saw from seed to spagyric, right? Like that's a plant that was grown here just down the road from me and my friend John's farm, and we handled it from the beginning to the end, right? Every stage of its life passed through my hands, which is like a really unique relationship that you can have with medicine, right? We can't say that of metals. I can't plant gold and then turn it into an oil. But with the plants, yeah, we can participate in that entire life cycle. So that's special. And then quality control. When you grow the plants really well, like organically, give them what they need. You get a good growing season. Maybe you could bring in all these other elements too, like with biodynamics. You're bringing in astrology and kind of regenerative agricultural practices and all this stuff. And that leads to, of course, a very strong plant. And then harvesting at ideal time, processing immediately after harvesting, like all these things contribute to like a really good medicine in the end. Even just a simple basic spagyric tincture like that echinacea tincture can have really powerful effects, and that is one of my favorites, honestly. Like I don't travel anywhere without it because yeah, if you get like the best way to use it is if as soon as you feel like an inkling that you're going to get sick, that's the moment to hit it, right? You feel a little tickle or like you're a little run down and you're feeling tired, you feel like something might get you. It's like that's the perfect moment because often you can prevent the illness entirely, but you can use it as a treatment as well. But it really shines as like a preventative in that moment where something is invading, right? You can feel like your guard is down, something's trying to make its way in, and it just like it's just a big no. You put that echinacea in there and it just stops it in its tracks. Frequent dosing is the way to do it. For 2-3 days when it's hitting you, just like every couple hours, take some and do that until you don't feel it anymore. And often you won't get sick. Like I rarely get sick. There's like two things that lead to me getting sick. Like one is, getting to a certain level of stress or some sort of whatever negative feeling in life. And the other is if I don't have echinacea. If I feel that tickle and I don't have the echinacea, it might get me. But if I have it, as a line of defense, yeah, 9 times out of 10, I don't get sick. I just get the, tickle in my throat or something.
There's a really interesting sort of correlation also, or experiment that can happen for people that are magicians. We talk a lot about, right? Everybody talks about astrological magic. It's very popular now. But the astrological magic is predicated on the idea of synthemata, these occult virtues, which are the mixed and permutative essences of the gods, or maybe the Platonic forms. I don't know, but it's that the essences you were talking about. We can never find them in their fullness here, but we can only ever find them in permutation. So it's predicated on being able to find that stuff and discern it in plant material, in mineral material, in metals, and in animal materials as well. It's a big part of that was in Paracelsus's Materia Medica, and it's a huge portion of all traditional medicines in their Materia Medica. So or pharmacopoeia, but one thing that I've found to be a real boon in my magical practice is to take a real spagyric tincture, is to in some way assimilate the signature. So you now have a gnosis, you have an experiential knowledge of the signature of that herb or whatever it is. I know what this feels like now. And it's easier to identify the signatures for the purposes of magic when you have taken that plant spagyric into your body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's interesting when you go back, it's all these traditions always had they imbibed something, and that's something I feel like has been stripped away, and many traditions that have, lasted the ages or have been passed down through the ages and gone through their various incarnations, is that you see a lot of stripping away of the actual taking of things. Sure, we may still have the magical tools, which, can play their own very important part, of course, in things like magic, but taking away that ingestion of something, literally putting something inside your body and letting it fill you up with its signature, is a really, really important thing. And it reminds me of an analogy I use often, my clinical practice, my clinical herbalism practice, is that I speak about the plants or any medicines you're taking about like music, right? You imagine that your body is like this orchestra. It's got all these instruments creating hopefully a harmonious, timely piece of music. And then when we fall ill, for whatever reason, there's parts of our orchestra which are failing. Somebody's singing too sharp or flat, or the drummer can't keep time anymore in a certain part. It's like, these little bits and bobs of our own little inner music go off, right? And for whatever reason, we can't remember how to play that part correctly any longer. But then we've got nature, which has this vast array of things which are also singing songs, and we can look to nature to find, herbs or mushrooms and metals and gemstones, which are singing that same song of health, which is missing or imbalanced in ourself. And then when we bring it back into the body, it's not just that it's doing the work for us, but it's reminding that aspect of our own health. Like, oh yeah, no. Here's the beat. Get back on it. It's like you're bringing a guitar tuner into it, or like a metronome or something like that, to help remind the body, which is, I think, a great thing about natural medicine is that, when used correctly, it's not creating a reliance upon that substance. We talked about addiction. You don't need it anymore, right? Like once you're back on track and you're singing your song correctly again, the orchestra's back together and sounding good. You don't feel that hunger for that thing any longer. It's left its impression, and now you can go on and do it yourself. But yeah, it's I think it's an interesting way to look at this like vastness of, you mentioned like pretty much anything outside of ourselves could act as a medicine, right? It's like these outer reflections of things that are inside of ourselves.
I gotta chime in. Okay, so you said this was probably like 10 minutes back, but you said transformation and transmutation in the same sentence. And that's something I wanted to ask you about. I wanted to ask you, what is the difference between transforming and transmuting?
It's a big question. More on the transmutation side of things. So I think it's something that's argued about in the literature, and something I'm still finding my own place with. So like transformation is just the process of change, right? So I think it's a bit more open-ended and vast than transmutation. So if we'd say transformation is the process of change, let's say, for example, you've got an essential oil and it's in an oil, right? And then when you heat it, it turns into a gas. Then you condense it and it turns back into an oil again. Like it's gone through a change, inarguably, but it hasn't turned into something else, right? Transmutation is when something turns into something else. And I think that is, definitely a worthy topic of debate, and has been a topic of debate, back and forth between alchemists and, many other people, forever, is the idea, can something turn into something else? Or what is the definition of that, right? Because we could say, there's the most overt, obvious example in alchemy of like, okay, you could turn base metals into gold. So you could take some physical lead and turn it into gold. I haven't done it. I'm not convinced, by anybody else. I hear that I don't completely rule it out. Part of me, like, there's a part of this like that's just uninteresting to me. Like, I think lead is awesome as itself and gold is awesome as itself, and like I'm not super interested in converting the lead into the gold so much, but maybe it's true. So that's like a stark example of this idea of transmutation, of something literally turning into something else. But then we can get more subtle with it, right? Maybe, like, for example, let's look at a very basic spagyric process, like a spagyric tincture. In this simple process, you extract an herb with some alcohol and you burn the plant material afterwards and extract these salts, and then you put them back together and something happens, right? It's different than, I gave the example of an essential oil being heated and turning into a gas and then being cooled and turned back to the essential oil. Like, it's gone through a process of change, but it's not something different, right? But chemically speaking, even with a very simple process like a spagyric tincture, you've got these compounds which are opposing one another, this polarity that we've been talking about tonight. So the polarity of, let's say, alkali mineral salts and largely acidic active constituents, which you have extracted from the plant. They're opposing one another. And then when you combine them together, new compounds are created as a result of that. So I think an argument can be made there that there has been a transmutation. Is it the be all end all? Like, the process is not finished at that point. This is not the philosopher's stone, but this is a step along the way. Perhaps this is a first step of transmutation, because chemically speaking, it's like something has turned, like there are many things that turn from one thing into another thing. That argument can get quite nuanced, though, right? As we dive deeper and deeper into it, it's harder. It's less of a clear example than if we turned lead into gold. But I think it bites on the same kind of stream. And it also, this topic, it speaks to the argument in alchemy of whether people can do better than nature. Like there's the idea that there's kind of this relay race going on where nature brings things to a certain point of evolution, and then it creates consciousness in this varying degrees, and eventually something like humans picks up the job, like in a relay race, takes the baton and then carries on evolution further. There's that idea, but then there's also the opposing idea that no, nature cannot be superseded. That that this is all fakery, essentially. That alchemists, they're mimicking nature, but they're not doing as good of a job, or they can't do as good of a job. And then there's the in-between idea that nature does things perfectly, and that when humankind understands those lessons, that humankind can do it equally to nature, right? So there's kind of again, there's a tria prima here where there's like some people say it's wrong, some people say it's right, and some people say it's somewhere in the middle, this idea of transmutation, or even just evolution in general. So it's an interesting topic, and one that, again, I haven't quite landed on. I often don't really take a hard stance on anything. I think it's, you wait 5 minutes and your best idea 5 minutes ago is trash, when you learn something else. And I just keep experiencing that over and over again. So I find it really difficult to latch on to one thing is true or false. But, to come back to your question, those are the basic, principles of transmutation versus transformation. One is the process of change, and the other is the process of one thing turning into another.
I want to ask you, Ike, well, first, if you have any thoughts on that. Second, since he mentioned evolution, I'm curious if maybe you can share your perspective on evolution versus adaptation.
Well, the first thing that kind of comes to mind when based off of what Daniel said was, I've thought long and hard about this, and I've allowed my experience to really guide me, and I've not really come to any hard conclusions either about this idea of perfection in nature. I think that as a gestalt, nature wants to express essence. But that essence is simpler than things that have a more sophisticated expression of soul, selfhood, like a human being. And nature expresses, therefore, its essence through instinct, which is something that is more. It sounds contradictory because, like a survival instinct sounds very, very self-centered. But at the same time, we have to look at the interconnectivity of nature, and we have to look at it as a gestalt, and we have to understand that instinct as a phenomenon is almost like this web of interconnectivity. You could almost say that an animal's instinct or a plant's instinct, in something like heliotropism, the instinct to turn the plant to face the sun. I don't know what else to call that other than instinct. There's some sort of there's programming, some relationship, some consciousness. It seems to be more diffuse and consistently within relationship, within holism to the entirety, whereas human beings tend to separate themselves out of that. Our participation is willed. Our participation is variable. And so what I see is that human beings, particularly in magic, we can create a perfect thing, but we can't create a perfect system. Nature, nature's working is perfect systemically on a larger scale because there different rules apply, right? Out in nature, shit has to eat other living shit to survive. That's not necessarily good for human beings to have to compete in that way and devour each other. So we have this very simple, meaning small amount of variables, phenomenological interplay with things. Our consciousness can act upon one thing at a time, two things at a time. Whereas in nature, there is this interconnectivity that even when it manifests as something selfish or in terms of a self-preservation instinct or something like that, in reality, what's happening is it's part of a larger dance. And so I think that we will, as human beings, you'd be the greatest alchemist in the world. You'll never be able to create something systemically perfect, but you can create something that is phenomenally perfect. You can create a perfect noun, a thing, but you cannot create a perfect web in the same way. So nature is working. I think I've thought about this a lot because there's a justification here for whether or not one should interfere karmically with via magic, via the technology of changing phenomena, in a way that employs a different set of rules and therefore invokes a different species of merit. There's an ethical imperative to this when you're doing things like that. So that's something that I've thought about a little bit that I just wanted to kind of offer up for food for thought, right? I don't necessarily know that I have a hard view in there, but I think that lots of things to think about, particularly for alchemists, particularly for magicians, for people, for human beings in general. Some of it might be obvious, right? But still worth thinking about. Now, Sky, I lost you on the second question. Could you repeat that for me again?
Evolution versus adaptation. What would be the differentiation?
I feel like they're the same thing. What do you think, Daniel?
Well, I think you're speaking about it, and it's a good point that you're making too. It's like the difference between right and wrong, it gets very, very confusing, it seems, as we evolve. It's like they get closer and closer and closer together, and it's difficult to determine sometimes. Like you said, this is an ethical issue, but something you said, it kind of sparked a thought, and it's this idea that there's adversity in life, which I think is kind of like a first medicine, which it stimulates us to do something about it, right? And this adversity, we could think about, you talked about, life eating life, and one thing's trying to eat and survive, and the other thing's trying to defend itself and not die, and it eats its own things. It's like there's this friction going on in adversity, and when we're problem solving that, or when nature is problem solving that, like it seems like maybe it's that adaptations are happening first. It's like, okay, we adapt to a situation, and maybe we relieve ourselves of some sort of issue in the moment. But when those adaptations are repeated over and over and over and over again, I think that's what stimulates what I would consider evolution. And we see that again in the lab work, where we can incite a certain level of change by doing a process once. But like when we talked about with the metallic work, like distilling this Alkahest off and returning it to the open salts over and over and over again, like you do that 7 times or 30 times or something, and the end product is almost indistinguishable from if you had only done it once. Yeah. Right. So maybe it's where, when adaptations becomes habitual and perpetuated, that it starts to actually create tangible, lasting, and then later on replicated change. It's not like, this monkey did this one thing once and then it was never done again. It's like, no, it was repeated in that individual, and then it might be repeated in the species and offspring. And then eventually, such a great change occurs where, something doesn't even really is almost like a different thing, and I think it's an interesting thing to consider. I mean, we're talking about evolution here, right? Like Darwin's theory, essentially here, survival of the fittest, and, adaptations eventually leading to what is claimed to be transmutation, right? One animal turning into another. We got, like like weird mammal creatures, like turning into whales, and all, actual changes of like one species to another. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, can you believe that the fucking dinosaurs, turned into like
chickens.
chickens and birds? I just think to my every time I see like a bunch of seagulls like flocking over a ripped apart McDonald's bag of stale fries, I swear to God, I just shake my head and go, how the mighty have fallen.
Yeah, we're moving backwards. Well, that's the thing, right? In this cycle, it's like, things are moving ahead and things are moving backwards. It's like you got to keep that polarity going, right? Those opposing forces. Again, bringing this back to the question, and this idea of adversity, right? That, like, Saturn is the adversary, right? Like, so that base lead metal, that symbol, it makes so much sense. It's like at the very bottom of anything that is, the very first state, it starts with
Well,
adversity.
and let me be a little Platonic about this, or a little Socratic about this. Sky asked, okay, what's the difference between adaptation and evolution? And so what Socrates would likely do would say, well, there's no context, because these two things, you need to contextualize this question, because as Daniel pointed out, we can talk about this Darwinistic survival of the fittest. And I think that there's a lot there having to do with adversity. That's how you started off this that portion of your thoughts. And now we kind of come full circle to Saturn as the adversary. Now, I kind of know the types of questions that Sky asks me, because we've been doing this for a long time, and he knows me enough to be able to sort of, the way that they have like I don't know, these little fences for cows to like bring them to the kill shelter. Like Sky can kind of maneuver me in that way. But I think one of the things for me is what I had alluded to earlier, is that nature is operating with a different set of rules. So, in other words, somebody like me, as opposed to a hard, Daniel, I've studied with you, and we're going to continue to study together. And I've learned alchemy from you. I've learned alchemy from Phoenix. I've learned alchemy from Sky. So I'm not discounting myself as an alchemist, but I'm not going to place myself with you guys. That's fucking absurd. But so I'm not necessarily that level of an alchemist, but I am a magician, and I am an initiator, and I've gone through these initiatic processes. So my one insight would be this, right? What is the context you're asking about in terms of, adaptation and evolution? Because evolution has a very different set of rules when we're talking about something like spiritual evolution or the evolution of the soul, because of what happens when you begin to move in that direction rather than material evolution, where material evolution has to do with survival, whereas spiritual evolution has to do with yielding. It's much more there's more of a yield there than an assertion, than there's a different kind of strength. And one thing that I want to point out about Saturn that a lot of people get wrong, or not get wrong, but see one way. We tend to associate Saturn with death, right? He's the adversary. He's entropy. He is boundary restriction. He comes with the scythe, to harvest the soul. But what I said earlier about the soul having to die to the spiritual to be incarnated to the material. Well, some people look at Saturn at their death as him coming, reaching with his hand and grabbing and taking you. But the people that I think have experienced spiritual initiation realize that it's Saturn finally retracting his hand and allowing the soul to be reborn and leave this law, this realm of material laws that actually are antithetical to the nature of the soul. This is the Platonic position. This is the Hermetic position, the Gnostic position, and I would say it's the current initiatic Western esoteric tradition, where there's a different set of rules. There's a different vantage point, a different perspective when we talk about material of the evolution of a substance and a thing, or the evolution of nature, and the evolution of the human soul. So I don't know what you were talking about, but I think I said enough there to clarify for anybody that was interested.
Yeah.
Well, would it, I mean, if I was to say in relation to the soul, or just if applied to consciousness in general, if you were to apply adaptation to consciousness, or evolution to consciousness, would that be a sufficient context?
That's
I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's hard for me to extract my, I tend to think that if you're adapting to something. For instance, when I was playing college lacrosse, we had to run until we fucking puked at 5 o'clock in the morning. We had this athletic trainer named Mark. He was from the Air Force Academy. This guy beat the living shit out of us. Not, I mean, he didn't actually lay hands on us, but he just made us go. And he would tell us, a warrior doesn't give up. A warrior adapts and moves forward. And it helped. I found ways to, when I had a cramp, I would literally like make my hand like a claw and dig it out as I ran, and like finding these ways to adapt. But on the other hand, you know, there's this, you're coping with something, like Dan said. There is an adverse feeling and an adverse kind of effect. I think maybe the product of that, if we're talking that aspect of consciousness, becomes evolution. My consciousness evolved. It had a higher threshold for pain, and it had a greater hold. It had more discipline, and I evolved in that manner from making those adaptations. But
Mm,
on the, we could take it a lot of different ways, as we
yeah.
could take any part of this conversation. We could kind of like, could be an episode in and of itself.
I was thinking almost uh, evolution's perhaps the integration of adaptation.
I think that's a good way to put, like, I think it goes back to your other question. It's almost synonymous with uh, transformation and transmutation, right? Transformation is like adaptation, and transmutation is evolution,
Hmm.
And like you just said, Sky, it's like, or I made the example too. It's like, if something is done once, okay, maybe that's a temporal adaptation to a situation. But if that is repeated over and over and over again in an individual, then that's passed on to, offspring, of a, plant or animal or whatever. Eventually there something new is born of those changes that are
It's almost
being
like
made.
a habitual or hereditary integration type thing.
I think it's somewhat difficult. It's almost like saying, where does hot end and cold begin? You know, it's a spectrum, I think, like the process of change, and like where do you go from, where's the point of the old thing and the new thing? And again, I think it's very easy, and maybe it's why it's used as an example to say, oh, this was lead before and now it is gold. That's a very, very hard lined example, which I think makes a really strong point. Um, whether it be true or not almost doesn't even matter in the, the philosophical value is there. It's a stark example of like, this is that, and this is this. Like this thing used to be black and now it's white. Like this thing used to be lead and now it's gold. Like it's like, going from one polarity to the other. But there's that journey in between, right, which is necessary to get from point A to Z, and that's the whole transformative aspect or adaptation aspect of it. So yeah, I think those are kind of synonymous terms: adapt, transform, evolve, or transmute.
All right. I want to get to cloud water extraction. What's going on with cloud water extraction?
Ooh, fancy. Cloud water.
Cloud water, yeah. I love this concept. This is a concept that comes from Hollandus, and I mean other people write about it in different terms and things, but it's the idea that you gently extract the endogenous water from a plant. So you've got a plant, it's got this natural water content to it. Even a dried plant will have water content to it. Fresh plants, of course, more. And so you are gently distilling this out, never hot enough that you'll actually burn the material that you're working on, but you're gently sweating out this moisture. And this moisture, this water is then used as a menstruum to then go back and extract that same plant further. So, you're distilling out this, again, it's this process of distillation and cohobation. You distill something out and then you take that distillate and you put it back on the physical substance that remains behind in the distillation. I think it's, when I think about why would it be called cloud water, for me, the most stark reasoning for it is that sometimes it looks cloudy. Yeah, it looks milky. I mean, it's like you're calling it as you see it, which is often the case in alchemical descriptions. They can be very contextual, just but calling it as they see it, right? So the cloud water really, I think, if we were to give it some like a modern definition, it's really like a hydrosol. Like if you distill an essential oil, the water that distills over is the hydrosol, and that water can be full of the essential oil of the plant, and these oils can make it look cloudy. Depending on how you work, you may not draw off all the essential oil, and maybe you're only getting a little bit of it, and because this water in the plant also will contain some, volatile compounds like, again, endogenous alcohols and ketones and things. It's able to bring with it and bring into dissolution non-water soluble oils. Right? Like you often see this when you distill an essential oil and a hydrosol. The hydrosol, when it first comes over, can look super cloudy, and eventually it clarifies. And that cloudiness, really what it is like oil droplets, tiny, tiny, tiny little oil droplets that are making the solution look milky or cloudy. And if you let it settle, it'll separate. The oil will, generally float to the top, and the hydrosol will clarify. But that's what this cloud water is. It's essentially like a hydrosol of a plant, which forms a unique and potent solvent, which you can then use to extract the plant. It's like this beautiful idea that everything is whole in itself, and that everything has within itself the tools required to evolve. Back to that evolution term, that you don't need anything outside of something, one thing, a plant, yourself, an animal, like that. Everything needed for that thing to, unfurl and reach its highest potential. All those tools are tucked in your tool belt already. You don't need to look outside yourself. And I love that concept, and that's what I think I love the most about this way of working that Hollandus describes. Is it is very much playing on that concept where right off the cuff, like you don't have to reach to alcohol or vinegar or anything else. It's like you take that plant, pull out its moisture, and then use that very same moisture to go back and further extract that plant.
All right. So, contrary to popular belief, an elixir originally referred to a solid, not a liquid. I was wondering, can you please elaborate on that? And if you have any references to where this is historically talked about or anything like that.
Yeah, this is it's an interesting point because yeah, most people today think of an elixir as like some sort of sweetened medicine, generally a liquid. But originally, yes, it referred to a powder, essentially. So we could go back to Arabic, elixir. Sometimes that is loosely translated to from the ashes in an alchemical state, alchemical perspective. It also speaks to the Greek word xerion. These words are all talking about powders, of varying forms. Sometimes it's speaking to like the black makeup that was used in Egypt, like eyeliner. But depending on the context, and alchemy is always highly contextual. The elixir is often, and well, at least originally, referring to a solid substance which is produced, a medicine which is produced as a solid, and often a powder. So that's that's the origin of it. It's changed significantly over time, and I think there's a lot of argument about it because again, these terms they're just there's no standardized terminology for this, although there are some basic rules which most people adhere to, alchemically speaking. Terminology is so highly contextual. So an elixir for one person is something completely different for another person. Both could be right at the same time and describing entirely different things, but factually speaking, an elixir originally was referring to a powder and not a liquid.
Do you think that the vernacular will or could be improved by being systematized? Do you think that would ultimately do more damage or just not really contribute beneficially to the modern alchemical culture? Because there is definitely, I think personally, this will be remembered as a period of a distinct period of alchemical work right now, what we're kind of in the thick of right now with people like you and other alchemists. You think that that's something that should be pursued? Do you think it's kind of maybe a waste of time, or what are your thoughts?
Kind of a little bit of both, really. I think what you're speaking to is like this time right now, because it's so easy for people to communicate in a way that was never possible before. I think a natural result of that is that there will be more standardization of terminology. People will tend to get on the same page. There's always going to be disagreements, but it's easier for people to kind of jump on a bandwagon and say, no, this is this and that is that, because it's easier for us to communicate. And I think in certain contexts, it's got utility, right? Like if I'm in let's say clinical practice, the terminology describing this medicine or that medicine is very, very important. It's like we could say, I can compare this to like common names of plants compared to Latin, like scientific naming of plants, right? You can have like 20 different plants that share the exact same common name, but they're different things, right? So in a clinical setting, we don't want that type of like margin of error where it's like you told me to take this and I took that, but it was not that, right? So we want exactitude in this case. So there's certain situations like clinical practice where that's got a lot of utility to it. At the same time, it kind of comes back to this whole like fate and free will thing where there's this individual process that everybody is going through to evolve themselves. And so that subjective experience, I think, requires that looseness, you know. I think there's value in both. There's value in both. There's value in using many different terms to describe the exact same thing, or one term to describe the same thing. It depends on the context. I've thought about this quite a bit. I think probably because I come to this, as a clinical practitioner. So oftentimes it's like, for my own self, I need a set of terminology to use because I need to be able to communicate to people that come to see me, and take my advice, to help themselves. I need a fairly standardized terminology to make sense of it. They need to know what I mean when I say take this and that. But outside of that context, I don't know. I guess I question like how valuable that really is. This is a concept that comes up in a book I've got called Hermetic Arcanum, which is by Jean Despanier, I believe his name was, and he talks about this, just like this kind of, there's so many different ways to describe the process of alchemy, and you can have completely conflicting views, yet those two different viewpoints ending up at the same end goal. So like, who cares what you called it, right? It worked. Like if it works, it works. It doesn't matter how you call it. So I think there's arguments to be made both ways, and I'm not overly concerned about standardizing, or making an effort to standardize outside of my own personal clinical practice. But then at the same time, I think that it quiets the noise, right? It definitely makes it easier to understand if there's an agreed upon set of rules, which essentially there is. But how much we dial that in is the question, right? So I'm unconcerned really about it, but it's interesting to look at it both ways.
Clinically, do you tell your patients to mingle the blood of the lion with the gluten of the eagle?
Depends on the patient.
Yeah, I understand exactly what you're talking about too. Where it's like, look, if it works and we end up at um the same or a similar sort of outcome, product, conclusion, then I think that in something like that, like for instance, and I don't consider myself an alchemical expert. I consider myself somebody who's an expert in magic and theurgy and that sort of stuff. So I wouldn't seek to systematize other people's vernacular, but what I would try and do would be to create more communication and dialogue between get people talking with one another so at least we understand each other. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? So I need to know like think of math, right?
Mhm.
Right? So order of operations is a big one, right? Because you get this big fucking mess of an equation with all these parenthetical sort of things. And so how do you figure it out? Well, in the States it's PEMDAS, right?
Mhm.
But in the UK, it's something like I think BODMAS or something like that. They have a totally different. But if you use the the order of operations, regardless of the words, regardless of they actually work out to be the same answer.
Mhm.
But the important thing is to be able to transpose and discuss with one another. Okay, what does your term mean? I think that would be important for me as a practicing ceremonialist. And if I ever did work in a clinical milieu like you do, My clinical milieu was in physical therapy, which is extremely standardized, right? Because there's oversight, you know, and things like Chinese medicine and things like that. I would want to have some understanding of what the other, terminology kind of meant, so that I could just be able to have a level of fluency in the community, and we'd be able to sort of help each other, right? Because that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to kind of bounce ideas off of each other and exchange ideas with each other. And I think a unified vernacular can help. But I do agree with you. I really do agree with you. I don't think that everything has to be reduced to one system of standardization, because then after that it becomes monolithic. It's really hard to innovate and discover new things.
Too rigid. It trying to, it's again, alchemy is everything, right? So it's like, okay, this is the set of rules and words, from this limited human experience. I think we are of course going to make errors if we try to do that. But in thinking about this, like, I'm going back to your comment about the time right now and thinking about that, and it's like, you know these different practitioners before, it wasn't just that they were disconnected and so they didn't have the same terms. That's part of it, and different streams of alchemy. But there's also an intention to confuse by using many different words to describe one thing, or one word to describe many things. There's intention to obfuscate, and to me, it feels like we're in a time of, and maybe this is just me, but a time of apocalypse, like a time of revealing, right? Where things are clarified. And so I think naturally, again, it's just happening because we have this connectivity through ease of communication and travel, being able to connect with one another on this stuff. So out of that is naturally born something a little bit more standardized. And a second thought I had too is that for me, what's most important is that because I interact with the public with my work, I want to share this work with other people. What's important to me is that they understand what I'm saying. Even if what I'm saying is not what somebody else is saying, I need to say what I'm saying and use the terms that I'm using in a way that people can understand and relate to it. I don't want it to be a mystery, to people, like if they're coming to me to try something, or they're coming to me, as a clinical patient, I want them to understand what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to do with these medicines. So, it becomes more of a, sure, there's like a greater, public aspect of that, but it's also kind of on a one-to-one scale, where it's just like, I want to make sure that everybody that interacts with me understands what I'm saying, which is not always easy, because I'm an alchemy nerd, and it's really easy for me to go really far out on a limb and just deep dive in. And I'm in this all the time. Like, I'm constantly thinking about this and doing this and going deep, and so it's very easy to stimulate me to just go deep into a rabbit hole, whatever rabbit hole I may be going down at that time. But yeah, with terminology, and that's what I've tried to do with, a couple articles on the different terms that I give my different medicines. I don't think everybody has to use them. I don't encourage people to use them if they don't feel like it makes sense to them. It's the terms that I use that make sense to me. And yes, it does build upon other authors and teachers I've had. There is some sort of, it's a sensical system that I've put together, but it doesn't have to, like, everybody doesn't have to use it. And I'm using it to clarify things. Again, back to this point of like revealing what was usually hidden. I think, we're changing as humans, and in a temporal sense, we don't always need the same rules, as much as, I think alchemy still can be vilified, or there's a risk, there's certain inherent risks to it. And I think it's, anything that's a powerful truth, you have to handle it with care. But at least in my experience with it, I feel like it's really important to reveal alchemy for what it is, as best as I understand it. I feel that feels instinctual to me. But we were talking about instinct earlier. It feels like an instinct, and at least at this point, I could regret it later. That happens in life, but I don't feel like I'm doing anything wrong to openly speak about some of these things, which, at a different time would not be openly spoken about.
Beautifully said. I've got a couple more questions. I wanted to ask you, you had a post and it was like some kind of vial. I don't know if it was like gold oil or something in it. It said ether and fixed fire element, and then it said watery dregs left from rectification. I was just curious, what does dregs refer to?
Oh, it depends on the context, of course, but like, dregs could be like the bottom of the barrel of like, a beer keg or wine. Like it's like not the good stuff, basically.
Oh, okay.
Not the good stuff. If I could simplify that answer, yeah.
That sounds good. And then I wanted to ask you about stone feeding. That's probably one of my last questions is, yeah, stone feeding. What's it all about?
Well,
What
we,
the hell is
really,
that?
we
Explain that, Dan.
we've touched on it already, right? We talked about it with it's the same process really that we talked about with the metallic work, this whole like opening a metal, and then you have this open body, and you feed it this spirit, you distill it off and give it back. That's one way of feeding a stone of many different kinds. There's stones, and then there's the stone. There's the end of the work, the philosopher's stone, the great work. But then there's all these other different variations of that work, and they really they mirror each other, of course. Um, Really, it's just this process of you've got a body, and it's dead in its first state. You've separated and purified. You've killed something, usually in this work, basically. You've pulled something apart. You've separated that animating soul and that spark of life, the
Osirified it.
Mercury. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You've taken it apart. You've chopped it up. Yeah, and now you got to put it back together again. You've taken the parts, you've separated them, you've refined them, and now you want to put it back together to create like a new incarnation that's evolved from its original state. And there's a couple different ways of going about it. And there's a gazillion ways really, but I'll mention two obvious ways. One is, often people refer to it as like feeding a baby, where you've got a salt of some sort, and you very carefully feed the sulfur or the mercury, these two liquids usually, drop by drop, sometimes one at a time. Like sometimes it depends on the work. It could be sulfur first and then mercury, or some people mix the sulfur and mercury together. But either way, the main concept is that you've got this empty vessel, this body ready to receive this source of life, and you are drop by drop feeding it, just giving it just enough to satiate it. And that's the philosophy of it, and the reality of it is, you're adding these drops of, let's say, an oil or spirit, until the salt can no longer take any more. You don't want to drown the baby, so you want to give it just enough that it's well fed, and then let it digest, just like eating a meal. You want to eat just enough. You don't want to eat too much. That causes problems, or drink too much. It causes problems. So that's one way of feeding the stone, this very slow drop by drop method. And the other is what we kind of talked about earlier, where you can do this process of cohobation and distillation, where you've got, let's say, a larger amount of this liquid that's being fed to the salts, and you're gently distilling it off. So you're you're satiating this receptacle, the body, the salt, in a different way. You're reducing the liquid by distilling it off, and then the salt eats up as much as it can, and then you repeat the process over and over and over again, where you're distilling it off, the liquid off the salts, and then you're taking that distillate and you're putting it back. And with each pass, that salt is fixing more of these volatile constituents and evolving, so where eventually, basically the whole meal is eaten, where there's no longer, all of that life force, both universal and individual, that you're feeding those salts becomes completely and perfectly amalgamated with the salts. You reach that point of perfection where these opposites, fixed and volatile, meet in the middle, and are said to be then immortal or inseparable, which would be, that's the great work to create the Philosopher's Stone. The end journey is to get to that point of completion. So those are two different ways that I could think of that are commonly described of this process of feeding a stone.
Okay, and so in that same post I was referencing, it says the fixed oil being extracted from the dregs of the first rectification of the volatile oil and spirit. So the first rectification, so my curiosity was how many times do you rectify?
As many as you need. It depends,
Is it like
right?
intuitive or like is there like a
Well,
general?
I mean, there can be some intuition to it, but it's like until you get the job done well,
Hmm.
right? If you're not working very well, it could take many, 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 many times. But if you're really accurate and you've dialed your skill in, it doesn't take as much work. It's kind of goes back to what I was saying about the simplicity of things. It's like as you advance, the answers to your questions, and the medicaments for these stumbling blocks that you run into. It's like they just become easier and so much more simple as you advance. So it depends. It just really depends how you're working and what you're working on. But what I'm referring to there, again, we're talking about this difference between like fixed sulfur and volatile sulfur. It's like when you distill, the most volatile readily passes over in that distillation, whereas the fixed stays behind. So in that post, it sounds like I'm describing separating that fixed oil probably from, I'm assuming, water. It could, I'm not sure exactly what post it is, but it's probably fixed sulfur in some sort of water or less volatile liquid that's left behind, and you can then separate that and do further purification of that fixed sulfur.
Thank you. Ike, do you have any last questions, any responses, anything else before we wrap it up?
So what I'm hearing from this conversation is essentially that we are gonna start our own Hogwarts, and Dan is gonna be potions master. I'll do defense against the dark arts. Sky, what do you wanna? What do you wanna do?
I'll just model in the background.
Okay,
I'll dance.
so he'll be Filch. No, this is great, man. I love talking to you. I love talking to the both of you. This is a great energy. We should do this again.
Yeah, that was
Absolutely.
a fun conversation. It was a bit of a marathon. I know, I could talk to you guys forever, each of you individually, and even worse when we're all together. It just, again, we're talking about alchemy, so it's like nothing is really out of bounds. It's really hard to like put some bumpers around it, to say no, this is the topic, because it really does stretch into anything
Yeah.
and everything. And for curious people like ourselves, that makes for infinite conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool being able to hear a lot of the laboratory, you know, chemical nature of things, and then to get Ike, you to kind of depict a lot of the Western esoteric spiritual teachings of things and how that all relates and how they kind of coincide so beautifully. So,
it's a very broad conversation, but I think ultimately a very satisfying one because there's stuff in here that, hardcore, maybe seasoned alchemists or alchemy nerds, as Dan put it, are going to really have a bunch to chew on. And then on the other hand, I've always found alchemy nerds to be great because they also want to hear about the philosophical and spiritual stuff as well because they understand how that ties into their work. But that's also there for other people that are listening to the podcast that don't, are kind of new to the vernacular of alchemy, which can sound crazy. Feeding a stone, that sounds crazy.
It is crazy. Realistically, if you're not doing both, you're not doing it right. That's
yeah.
to me like there's got to be, and that's something maybe sometimes like there's a criticism of my approach because I often describe chemistry. Um, Really, my interest in chemistry is from a spiritual inclination, right? It's just better understanding these building blocks that we're working with in order to understand meaning in life, which is, quite a task to take on, right? So for me, and that's why I love alchemy in its holism. It's like you need to have both sides of the coin. There's the physical side of it and there's the non-physical side of it. There's the external side of it, like in the lab work, and there's the internal side, what's happening inside yourself. And when something's missing, like it's off. You're never going to reach completion with a missing variable like this, right? So you really need to have both sides of this. And yeah, it's great to have other people to bounce the stuff off of, so you can, it's so universal. You can find so many different examples of saying the exact same thing, and that is very, very helpful for I think a wide audience, to be able to latch on to it, be like, oh, I understand that, because maybe Ike's explanation of the Platonic viewpoint on what I was describing, that could allow somebody who has zero chemistry background to go back, listen to what I said maybe and say, oh, no, I get that now. Because for me, that's how I started understanding chemistry. It's like I wasn't good at chem. Like I'm a high school dropout. I didn't have a background in this. And it was, spiritual teachings, philosophical teachings, which made it easier for me to understand and have a reason to understand chemistry, right? So it's these things feed back and forth into one another.
Beautiful. Um, well, Daniel, where can people find you if they want to check out, maybe they want to read your blogs or check out more of your work or what you have out there for people? Where would you direct them?
Yeah, so there's my social media. So I've got kind of my personal journey with alchemy and herbalism. That's alchemia.arcadia. And then my business page, my Spagyric Apothecary, is Secret Fire Apothecary. And my website is secret-fire.com. And there you can find blog articles and a pretty good selection of my Spagyric Apothecary that I'm offering publicly.
Excellent. Ike, do you have any thing going on right now that you want to throw out there?
Um, well, I've got a shitload of stuff going on, but we'll save that for another day. I love Dan. We just worked on something recently where we worked together on this basics of spagyric alchemy. That's going to be coming out in the new year because I actually have to take like 4 months and base this stuff on lunar cycles and things like that, that's my fucking bag. That's right up my alley. But it's going to take some time to actually produce and get out there, but I'm really happy about that collaboration. So be on the lookout for that, my collaboration with Dan Wiseman. What about you, Sky? What's going on, man? Got anything you
Hmm.
want to tell people? You just did an
Uh,
awesome interview with Eric Purdue.
Eric Purdue. Yes, that was a
Nice.
fun one. I'm pretty stoked about it. So yeah, that's coming out. I'm gonna probably release that Friday. So hopefully I'll
Nice.
release this before Friday so that people can hear this and then listen to that one. So we'll see how
Well,
that
that's on you.
goes. But
He did that new edition of the Three Books of Occult Philosophy.
yeah,
Is
yeah.
that correct? Yeah, I think that one of the more popular ones that's out there is by a guy, Donald Tyson, who's from Halifax, Nova
Mhm.
Scotia,
Oh, is
actually.
he? Yeah.
Yeah, he's from Halifax.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
his
he did that way back, man. He was one of the
Way
first
back.
guys to put it out there with, I think he might have done it with Llewellyn or Weiser.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, Eric's cool. He's got a really good personality, so that episode is a pretty fun one. So I'm excited for people to listen to it.
All right,
But
so I got a question for Dan off camera real quick. So
uh
let's
Yeah.
thanks everybody who has listened to the podcast. We appreciate you greatly. If you guys want to listen more of myself, you could check out Philosophical Minds podcast. Uh, Ike over there, Arcanum podcast at YouTube. Daniel, check him out at secretfireapothecary.com and Instagram handle. What was your Instagram handle again?
Uh, Alchemia.arcadia and Secret Fire Apothecary.
Boom. Beautiful. We appreciate you all greatly and thank you. Until next time.
Thanks, guys.